Welcome back to part two, Luke. Thank you so much for everything in part one. It's just so intellectually engaging, and hopefully for everybody watching, it's just about slowly thinking about things and engaging with them themselves, and then coming back and going away and inviting others into the discussion as well. It's fabulous.
I mean, that fits in with one of my core beliefs, which is that philosophy and basically thinking about things is for everybody. You know,
Absolutely.
I don't consider myself any sort of academic or expert. All I am is another ordinary guy who's spent a bit of time thinking about something that some people might not have thought about,
Yes.
and trying to share that. So
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You finished part two, sorry, part one, by telling us about a text, which obviously I looked at when we read through the articles ourselves in August. Can you just go back to that text, and then I'll return to some of the questions that you sent to me, because one of the things that we like to do, and I know it seems a bit unusual, but what we like to do is we like the person who's being interviewed sometimes to set the questions, because otherwise they can find themselves possibly going down the road that they wouldn't chosen for themselves.
yeah,
And also when you're talking to people, they do engage in information. Um, and some questions they simply don't get asked, and they almost begging the interviewer to ask them.
yeah.
So I think it's really, really important that the interviewee is the one that's empowered, because the interviewer effectively is just managing the engagement, so to speak. So brilliant. Thank you so much. So if you want to go back to that text, that'd be
Okay.
wonderful.
Let's see if I can show it to you.
Yes.
It's called Humankind. It's by Rutger Bregman, who's a Dutch historian, and he is essentially arguing that our society has a false narrative of human nature, and it's reinforced all the time. And it's been reinforced by books like Lord of the Flies, where children are left on a beach and suddenly they're all horrible to each other. Um, there's a myth that when there's natural disasters, people will be fighting for themselves, whereas in fact, as soon as you start to analyze and look at what's happened in any sort of natural disaster, it's almost invariably features incredible amount of self-sacrifice and mutual aid.
Yes.
So he describes these. He spends a lot of time shredding the arguments that suggest we're inherently unpleasant and immoral people, and putting forward really good evidence and arguments for the fact that there's an inherent decency. And one reason I refer to the book is that I think that inherent decency is one of the reasons why people would want to engage with morality. So if morality is a tool for uniting communities and people, then an inherent decency in those people will make them want to use that tool. They think, yeah, actually, I want us all to get on together. I'd rather have peace than war. I'd rather have community than incohesion. So let's try using this tool and see how it works for us.
It's really interesting that you've used the phrase inherent decency, because it does go back to a point we talked about in part one about whether it's more intrinsic to us as opposed to external. And you give some amazing examples, like you say, in terms of Lord of the Flies, and then you give the other empirical examples where actually the opposite happened. But a really populist example, if you don't mind me using it, is the Titanic, because what we had in the Titanic obviously was a number of lifeboats that couldn't facilitate everybody on board. And of course, what was perceived to be human decency was to remove the women and children first, for the men to stay behind unless there were capacity in the lifeboats, and for the captain to be the last one to leave the ship, so ultimately go down with, in this case, his ship. So we have a very clear example there of a hierarchy, and what you could argue is a manufactured decency.
Yeah, that is a very interesting topic to think about, isn't it? How much of that just reflects the social mores and the distinction between what morality is and what social mores tell us. And given that I argue that equality is very much an outcome of any sort of analysis of morality. Equality seems to be pretty fundamental in terms of what any morality might say. That does question the equality that wasn't applied in that case. Women and children were treated as somehow unequal. In this case, in a way, kind of more vulnerable and therefore needing looking after. But it wasn't equality, was it?
It was a positive discrimination,
Yeah.
and it was a patronising perspective, and that they are more vulnerable.
Yeah, that's right. Whereas actually, children can be more resilient than adults, and women can be tougher than men. So there's absolutely no real rule there empirically.
No, and absolutely, and it does introduce dichotomy in that the women and children, let's go for the children here, were the first off, and yet it wasn't long before the Titanic that we were sticking them up chimneys.
Yeah. Yeah, our history is a very strange and confusing one.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, and I will definitely get hold of that text and read it through. That'd be amazing. And maybe we can even come back to this topic in the future and just discuss that text.
Very happily.
Wonderfully, you've, as I said before, you've sent through some questions to guide me, and we've sort of got to the end of them now because we covered the topics. But there's one early on actually that I just wanted to engage with you with, because you clearly made it. And the question is, aren't you just preaching, telling people what they should or shouldn't do? Isn't this sort of, I don't know, sort of like a colonial imposition, so to speak? How do you respond to that?
I think I wanted you to ask me that question, because in a way, anybody talking about morality, it does have that connotation. It's kind of a historic one, where morality has been an adjunct to religion, or as I said right at the beginning, an adjunct to power.
Yes.
So preaching was really people telling people how to behave, how to think, how they must act within the rules of the current society. So I would say that I would hope to encourage people to read these articles on the basis that it's not preaching, that what I'm actually doing is, firstly, looking at what the nature of morality is, how we use it, how we use moral language, how we talk, and what that tells us about what this concept must be, how it hangs together. So I'm looking at the way the language is used, the way we make moral judgments all the time. We're always judging other people. Anybody who says they aren't is pretending to themselves. Yeah. Anybody who is two relatives and says, "Oh, that's your morality and this is mine," is actually pretending to themselves, because they really do want to say that multi-murderer, that's wicked. They really do want to say what you're doing is wrong, and that aspect of morality is where the universality kicks in. People really want it to be universal, even if they pretend otherwise. Yes. So I'm looking at the way we use the language, I'm looking at the concept, and then I'm saying, out of those two things, does that say something about what can be a legitimate moral claim or moral judgment, or a legitimate set of algorithms or rules for moral conduct? So it's not preaching, it's more empirical in the way you were talking about earlier. And out of that empiricism, try and draw out okay, so if that's the empirical nature of this concept and this use of language, then what sits comfortably? So how does the normative, what normative rules would sit comfortably within those characteristics?
Fabulous. Thank you. So again, it's back to that philosophical engagement. Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to the end now. This has been absolutely fascinating, as I've said earlier. It's just a wonderful analysis, a wonderful discussion that we all need to engage with. And the last question actually fits in like a glove with that. What would you like to be the big takeaway from your discussions of morality? And also linking into that, where does it take us? What's next?
Okay. So I actually have 5 central takeaways, which I would like, people who have read those articles to walk away with. And the first is seeing morality as a tool. It's a tool, it could be incredibly useful. It could actually be a lifesaver for our civilization. Let's give it a go. So it's that idea of not seeing morality as this fixed thing, as this objective thing, or even as a subjective thing. It's a tool. It's a conceptual tool, like money, like the legal system. It's something we can use, and let's use it well. The second thing is, actually I touched on it really, is it could be an invaluable tool. It could be a tool that helps us cohere in a way to address things like climate change, bringing an end to this tumultuous warfare that our whole species is tied up in, stopping the spiraling inequality, effectively the breakdown of capitalism needs to be addressed in some way. And this is a tool that could help us move on to the next stage. It also offers future proofing. So something people are really concerned about is AI. Now, why would an AI wish to engage with us if we weren't moral beings? If we didn't believe, supposing real self-conscious AI came into existence, if we didn't believe that they had a right to equality just like us, if we were people who were willing to just arbitrarily switch off a conscious being, an AI, then why would they engage with us? Why didn't they just wipe us out and start again? So morality offers kind of future proofing. Or with aliens, if aliens were to come, why would they engage with us unless they could think, yeah, they have a set of rules which they'll apply to us and to themselves, which give us an equal chance. So that's the second thing, is that it could be a really useful life-saving tool. And the third thing I wanted to mention is that I think that the nature of morality gives us two absolutely fundamental high-level rights. And one is to personal autonomy, and the other is to equal entitlement. And I think they are the yin and the yang of morality. You have to balance those things. They really form a basis which would allow communities and individuals and civilizations even to cohere. Personal autonomy, respect that. Equal entitlement, you're also equally entitled. Everybody should be free. Everybody's equally entitled to that freedom. One group shouldn't be more free than others, as with the Orwellian story. Lastly, I would like to say it's an easy tool to use. You can develop, once you start thinking about it as this tool and looking at its characteristics, it would be easy to develop a quite straightforward algorithm for how we're going to behave. How can each of us just get through life without having to think about it every single time, but having a basis for simple and straightforward behavior. So it's a simple algorithm. It's not actually that difficult. And lastly, there's one thing I'd like to pull out of it, which is kind of ignored by our society, and that is you can't force people to be moral. If freedom is essential to morality, and this is again anti that colonial idea. If freedom is something that people need to freely engage with, or other societies need to engage with us in sharing, then it can't be a question of force. Coercion and morality are inversely proportional. And that really is my punchline.
Excellent. Excellent. I mean, that's amazing. Thank you so much.
Talking about the future.
Yes, yes.
The second part of your question, very quickly.
Please, yes.
I'd like to turn those articles which I've sent to you into a book at some point. So that's my personal future, is at some point to work those into more detail and turn them into a book. But more importantly than that, I would like, because I think morality is so important and so potentially healing for society, I'm just really keen to share these ideas and hope other people will share them too.
Yes, and I think that comes on to my last question, which is it's something very entrenched within the articles that you wrote, is that there's one specific group that you argue, and with great validity and empirically reliable, that won't play the game, and that's those with psychopathic tendencies. So I think the last question is a really, really important one, especially when we talk about this universality and we talk about moving forward and it being a tool for humans to unite. What do we do about the psychopaths?
It's a really difficult one. I know it's one that you and Dorset I have had to challenge and face up to with some of your your pro kindness to immigration, kindness to immigrants message in your paper and in your views, is a problem, because there are psychopaths who really don't feel any impulse to be kind or generous or to recognize the desperate needs of other people. My feeling is that the two fundamental rules that seem to be falling out of the bottom of all my analysis, the recognition of equal entitlement and the recognition of personal autonomy, means that you approach psychopaths in exactly the same way as you approach anybody else. And you need a society which treats psychopaths in exactly the same way as anybody else, which is they need to be engaged with, and they need to know that their freedoms and their needs can't be greater, can't overrun the freedom and the personal autonomy of anybody else. So they can't overrule the equal entitlement. So my hatred, if I had hatred of say foreigners like Nigel Farage or somebody, that really can't be seen as more important than the equality of the equal entitlement of those people to a happy and decent life. Why should their lives be any worse than his? Why should a psychopath in any way feel justified in imposing their greed or their narcissism or their psychopathy on others? There's no moral basis for it. So we need a society which educates and engages and encourages people to behave in a moral way.
But if the nature of our sentience isn't uniform, if the nature of our sentience is actually quite different, depending upon hormones that we lack or hormones that we have too much of, if that's possible, obviously we're talking in a relative situation here, and therefore trying to engage with people who are perceived to be non-psychopaths in the same ways in which we respond to people who are, let's say, not diagnosed psychopaths. If they're not going to receive it and they're not going to respond to it in the way in which the non-psychopaths hope or intend, we still have to have a next level of solution, because if we want to get to the normative in relation to this morality tool, and they continue to hinder us, at some point we've got to probably make decisions en masse in order to achieve the end that we want, even though it's not the end that they want.
I think you'll love that book by Rutger Bregman. I think it's two points, really. One is that actually psychopathy isn't a predominant feature of human nature. So there are psychopaths, of course, in any population, but they're still actually a very small percentage.
But they dominate, though, Luke. But they dominate. They too, as evidence suggests, that they do tend to. I mean, the psychopath test shows us that John Ronson's book that they do tend to elevate to the top end of the hierarchy.
That's right. So there are more psychopaths among CEOs and senior managers than in the normal population, for example.
Yes.
So that's the second part of my answer. My second part of my answer is it's a small part of the population. So we need to ensure that the structures of our society don't encourage or facilitate the rise of that small part of our population into positions of power. So that's all about the kind of democratization of organizations of our society, which is a brilliant tool for minimizing the power of psychopaths. So it means that if you have much flatter hierarchy structures, there's less of a kind of system or structure that psychopaths can claw their way up. If you have much more egalitarian structures within companies, organizations, and so on, then psychopathy doesn't work as an advancement tool. So you need to structure your society In fact, that's the answer. You need to structure your society in ways that doesn't give psychopathy that route to power. That's not, I mean, that's kind of answer. Obviously, you need to go into huge amounts of detail on how you do that.
Of course, of course. So it's sort of along a revolutionary fervour in a way, because it's like basically trying to get the Tories and the Labour Party to turn to proportional representation. It doesn't suit them, and yet they're the only ones who can activate it. And
Yeah.
likewise, we have a hierarchy where the top end is dominated by psychopaths. The democratization of the process is going to be very, very difficult if they're the ones who effectively say yay or nay. So we
Yeah.
still need the answer as to how we democratize the system without them.
Yes. So you've touched on the central dilemma of the entire left and socialists across the world, in that our society has already been taken over. We've already seen the psychopaths have won. They're in power. Our world wouldn't be in the mess we talked about in the first part of this program if they weren't already in power, if they weren't doing all this damage to us and to our environment and to the structures of our society and to ordinary poor people. So they're in there, they're in power. How do you change that? That's a huge question. How do people unite and start to work together to remove the psychopaths in power? It's the challenge of our lifetime.
So to finish off, ultimately, I think that's a brilliant response, because ultimately what we go back to is that once we've identified the strategy for democratizing the system, we have the morality in the toolbox. The toolbox is ready and waiting. We've just got to find the solution to the other problem.
Yes, that's what I would say. That's true.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the show yet again. Luke, you've been amazing, absolutely amazing. And hopefully we can get together again very soon and engage on other topics as well. Amazing. Thank you so much. Amazing.
It's a pleasure.